Well, welcome back. In this particular video, I'm going to talk about something that kind of blends French philosophy with management, with something that's very germane right now, namely with the rise of the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movements. And namely, we're going to talk about sadism. And in order to kind of help you understand how all this is relevant to some of the contemporary movements again, such as Me Too or Black Lives Matter, we're going to begin with a little bit of a biographical sketch. In other words, who was the Marquis de Sade? And then, once you understand who he was, we'll contrast what is sadism versus something that you may be confusing it with, what is sado-masochism. Okay. Then I'm going to introduce a concept to you known as a heterotopia. And heterotopias are a key, although somewhat unexplored component that is necessary for sadism. They are separate spaces where certain kinds of acts or behaviors can be perpetuated. So once we get into what is a heterotopia, and then we will look at a variety of applications from both a societal but also a managerial perspective. So let's gonna give you just a real brief background on who was the Marquis de Sade. Now, there's been so much written about him that I could probably give you, 6 hours of video on his biographical background. But, we'll kind of leave that to some other people. Although if you guys really want me to do a full biographical video series on the Marquis de Sade, I'll be happy to do so. Just leave me some comments and I'll kind of whip that up for you. But long story short, Marquis de Sade was a French nobleman. He was somebody who was born into extreme privilege. He unfortunately did not have the closest relationship with his parents, and he was largely raised by his uncle, the Abbot of Desaad, Abbot of Desaad, so the Abbot of Desaad. And the Abbot was kind of a interesting character. So while, on one hand, he was very much a priest in the Catholic Church, supposedly he also had a woman, her daughter, and some sort of a maid living with him, and evidently they did all sorts of different kinds of activities that would generally be frowned upon in the church. So there's that kind of thing going on. But that was basically who raised him. Now, de Sade was someone, even as a young child, always expected to get his way. It was his way or really no way at all. And he eventually joins the army, and he has some different adventures. Most of these are kind of rather typical for someone of a high social class. Although, as a side note, the Marquis de Sade, comes from a very old, wealthy family from Provence. One of his ancestors was Lord de Sade, who is generally thought to be one of the muses of Petrarch's poems. Evidently, she was a lady of incredible beauty. But I'm digressing a little bit. Anyhow, so the Marquis de Sade has a relatively privileged upbringing. He always wanted to have things his way, otherwise he got pretty upset and threw horrible tantrums. He was in the army briefly, and where he starts kind of getting into trouble is he gets married to a family that had kind of financial and legal interests in France, but they were not aristocrats. He has a wife seems to get along with her pretty well, but the problem is he cannot stay away from prostitutes. And that in itself is not so unusual for that time, but what is unusual is that he had to do horrible things to prostitutes. He sodomized prostitutes, which was considered illegal at that time. He beat prostitutes. He was known for cutting into prostitutes, with a lash or a knife, and then pouring hot wax into the wounds to ensure extra pain. He would hold them prisoner. He'd do all sorts of horrible things that probably don't belong in this particular video. But needless to say, he had some sort of a sexual depravity, and he always thought that his behavior was okay, mostly because of the fact that he was an aristocrat. Because he was an aristocrat, he could engage in those kinds of behaviors. Okay? So, he keeps getting in trouble with the law for his behavior, and he has a mother-in-law who really likes him, and she keeps bailing him out. But of course, then it starts to hurt his wife, and then so, long story short, his mother-in-law makes it her life's mission to ensure that he spends his entire life in jail. And it's while he's in jail, he engages in a lot of reading and a lot of writing. And a lot of this time in jail is that time when he begins writing a lot of his famous books. 120 Days of Sodom is one of the most famous ones that he wrote while he was in the Bastille. Now, a lot of people say that when they tore the Bastille down, that they freed Marquis de Sade. That's actually not entirely true. Marquis de Sade was in the prison, leading all the way up to the French Revolution. It's kind of an interesting side note of history. Before the French Revolution, there were some protesters. They were kind of agitated outside the Bastille, and in order to increase the agitation, the Marquis de Sade took apart his chamber pot and was using the tube off of his chamber pot as kind of a funnel. And he was saying, "Help, help, they're killing the prisoners, free us." And so that obviously aggravated the crowd. And the reason he did that, actually they weren't killing anybody in the Bastille. It was a prison for predominantly aristocrats. It was actually quite a humane prison. Marquis de Sade could have alcohol, and people could bring in their pets, the dogs and their rugs and everything. And he even had a library in his cell. But he was mad because he couldn't take his walks on the turrets. The prison officials decided it'd be better if he stayed in his cell for his own safety. And so he was kind of throwing a tantrum. So they actually had him moved to the prison of Charenton right before they stormed the Bastille, because they said he was aggravating or agitating the rioters. So that's kind of an interesting side note in history. Okay. So, of course, Marquis de Sade, continues writing. He eventually kind of he's in and out of prison during the French Revolution, during the Napoleonic era. He eventually dies in prison. His biography, that more or less concludes his biography, although if you want more discussion of this, send me a comment. I'll be happy to do that. But let's talk for a second about sadism versus sadomasochism. And actually, I think I'm going to do that in the next video. So, if you are interested in this video, you like this video, make sure you subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.